If you have a table saw, then you're probably going to want to make at least one sled for your saw. They're super helpful for basically any kind of cross-cutting, cutting panels, particularly where you can't use your fence. The fence is primarily for ripping. So if you have to make a cross-cut and make sure something's really square, a sled's a great way to go. Of course, your miter gauge is useful in some situations, but I think once you have a sled, you'll find that you hardly ever use at least your stock miter gauge. So some things to think about when you are making your sled. The first one is size. Now, this is my sled. It's basically as big as I could make it for my situation. This sled is about 30 inches wide, and it's 26 and a half long. Now, the width is 30 because that's half the width of a 5x5 sheet of plywood, so that's about as big as I could make it in the width. The length is set because of how I store the sled. So when I'm not using my sled, it's stored in my under my saw here, and it just slides into a vertical cabinet there. So that sets the width. So think about where you're going to store your sled, and maybe size it accordingly. If you had unlimited storage issues or whatever else you're dealing with, I don't think I'd make a sled that's bigger than about 30 by 30. It just gets too big to work with. Another thing to think about is you can see my sled does not have a front support. I found that when I was doing this full time for a living, I was doing a lot more varied type of projects, and there were situations where I was cutting relatively large parts or maybe parts at an angle, and I found that piece was in the way on occasion, and so I just busted it off. So since that time, none of the sleds in my shop have had that front brace. Now, that would not work in the school environment just because the sleds need to be much more durable in that situation. But, this is my shop. I take good care of my stuff. As you can see here, I've got a pretty beefy fence on this thing. It's 2¼ inches thick. It's 3 layers of 3/4 inch plywood. This thing isn't going anywhere. So I've got plenty of support, and I've got lots of screws holding the fence on. So this works great for me. Another thing to think about is the shape of the fence. Now notice mine does not drop down on either side, and the reason for that is I want full support the whole width of the fence. I find there are times when that lower edge or lower height can be a little restricting on things. Now, I have fairly big hands, so it's easy for me to reach stuff. So you might consider making it lower on the sides. In the middle, I would suggest going about 5 inches. I think this might be, this one's 5. 5's a nice number because the maximum on most saws that the blade's going to come up is 3 inches. So if you cut through 3 inches, you want at least a couple inches past that. So this is 5 plus the half for the base of the sled. So I've still got plenty of material above here. Another thing to think about is grain direction. I'm not sure it shows up on there, but the grain direction is going this way on the base, and it's vertical on the fence. Now, of course, vertical because I'm using plywood. If you make your sled with the grain going this way, which I've done, what you'll find is, this Baltic birch plywood really tends to splinter. And if you cross-cut it, it's far more likely to splinter. You're going to get a much messier edge, particularly on the bottom, but even on the top. What you'll find is your kerf won't be nearly as clean. And for the same reason, I did that on my fence. And of course, it was easy to do that using plywood. Another thing to think about is where you want this curve. Now, if you notice at the ones at school and on my sled, the kerf is off center to the right. So the right side of the sled is smaller than the left side of the sled. That's done for a very specific reason. And that is, let's say, now in my case, this is about 14 inches from here to here, and this side is about 16. So I'll typically find the center and move the kerf to the right 1 inch, okay? So let's say I wanted to cut some material that was 15 inches long, okay, repeatably. So what I would do is set my fence at 15, and now I can take my material, put it up against the fence, and make a cut. Now, some people say, oh, wait, you've got the material trapped between the fence and the blade. That's okay, because I'm controlling it, okay? As long as I'm hanging on to that piece, that's fine. Okay, so that works great. What if I wanted to cut pieces that were 14 inches long? Now, in my case, I can set that at 14 just barely, but now let's say I want to go 13 and a half. I can't use my fence anymore, all right? So what do? I'll measure on this side 13 and a half. So that puts me roughly there, and I have enough room here to clamp a stop, okay? If the fence was reversed, let's say it was working like this, and I'm going to put another piece of plywood here to simulate that. Now let's say I want to cut a piece that's 13 and a half inches long. 13 and a half from here, I don't have room to clamp a stop. So I'll do it on the other side. Well, 13 and a half over here, I can't use my fence. Now I could clamp a stop here, but I prefer to use the fence on the right side. So just seems to work better if we make the right side smaller than the left side. Now that's, of course, assuming you're going to use your fence sometimes for a stop, which maybe you won't, but it definitely comes in handy. Another thing to think about, how many sleds do you need? Now at school, we typically have 2 sleds for each saw. We've got a regular crosscut with a narrow kerf, and we have a dado sled. Well, I have the same here. I've got another sled stored over here, looks just like this one, except it's got a wide kerf, and I'll tilt the blade and make cuts like that. So you might want to make 2 sleds. For this demonstration, I'm going to make another sled for my shop, but it's going to be a small sled. These are great, but they're big, and quite often I'm just cutting small parts. So I'm going to use this material, and I'm going to make a sled that's only about that big. All right, and that'll work just fine for probably at least half of the times I use a sled. I'm also going to use poplar for the back. I'm going to mill some 8-quarter poplar, and I'm going to keep it as thick as possible because I'm going to do the same thing where I don't have a brace at the front. I'll make it about 5 inches tall, and I will shape it. I just a little bit though. I think my preference is, like I said before, to keep it pretty much the same height. But one thing you might want to consider from a safety standpoint, it's nice to have a tactile clue on where your fingers are relative to the blade. Okay, so what I've meant to do, and I've just never gotten around to it, but I want to put a piece on here that's maybe just 1/4 of an inch thick, that when my hand touches that, I'll know that my fingers can't reach the blade, right? So maybe it needs to be about, 5 inches from the kerf, so that if I'm doing something and I'm can't see my hands for whatever reason, or I'm focusing on something else, I'll know when I bump that I shouldn't go past that point, or it's possible my fingers might get near the blade. Okay, I mentioned that I've used plywood here. This is 3 layers of 3/4 inch plywood. If you do this, which is, I think is awesome, but it's, it's a little more work than just milling a piece of poplar. You definitely, when you glue these up, you want to glue them together on a flat surface, right? If you just randomly clamp 3 pieces of plywood together, you're likely to inadvertently make a bent lamination, and you really want this flat. But like I said, I'm going to use poplar for my small sled. For the base, 1/2 inch Baltic birch works great. It's thin, so it maximizes your depth of cut. It's stable. It's not always super flat anymore. It used to be much flatter or more consistently flat. As for the runners, I like to use hard maple. It's hard. It's very dense, it lasts a long time, it machines easily with obviously the tools that we have. It's easy to fine tune the fit with a scraper. I'll show you how to do that. Easy to put screws in. So I'm a big fan of maple. Some people like to use that white high density polyurethane, I think it is, plastic, that white almost kind of waxy stuff. That can work okay. That stuff lasts forever. It's a little harder to work with just because it's not very stiff. You can buy the guides from a couple different manufacturers. I think they make them out of aluminum, things like that. But my choice is wood. We've got it. It's readily available. Easy peasy. So I'm going to mill up this, and when I get that ready to go, we'll start working on the sled.